On the 27th of November 1989, Avianca Flight 203 takes off on a routine flight from Bogota International Airport in Colombia. 5 minutes later, the Boeing 727 is ripped apart by a massive explosion. A 110 people are killed.
The death certificates read, cause of death, blunt trauma due to falling from aircraft. The plane exploded in midair and then crashed. And I am sure that while the plane was going down, many people were still alive on that plane.
Colombian accident investigators soon established that this was no tragic accident.
There was a cassette recorder where somebody was duped into believing that when they maintained a certain altitude that they would turn on that cassette recorder and they would receive certain instructions, and what it really was an explosive device.
The Colombian authorities realized the target of the attack was presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, who canceled his flight at the last minute. Gaviria has staked his political career on denouncing Colombia's most infamous cocaine godfather, Pablo Escobar.
Imagine one man ordering the destruction of an aircraft, and well over 100 people on board had to perish because of his one desire to kill one man.
2 of the dead held US passports. Escobar's indiscriminate slaughter has laid him open to the full weight of American justice.
There was always a big effort to capture Pablo Escobar, but this placed it on a worldwide scale, because at that point in time, you can charge somebody with terrorism, which creates a much, much greater jurisdiction when it came to American authorities and charges that you could pursue against an individual.
The destruction of Flight 203 is the latest outrage in a brutal criminal career that began when Escobar was just a boy. The son of a farmer and a schoolteacher, the future drug lord grew up in the dangerous streets of Medellin in the northwest of Colombia.
He initially started robbing gravestones from cemeteries and shaving the names off and then reselling them.
He was known to local law enforcement. He was a car thief. He was a bit of a thug, juvenile delinquent, if you will. That was his background.
But he soon realized there was a better way to make big bucks: smuggling cocaine. At the time, cocaine was grown and processed in Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. Then the marijuana smugglers of Colombia began to take an interest in this more profitable drug.
They started to bring in cocaine from Peru, from Bolivia, and converting it into cocaine hydrochloride. And then from there, they had access to the Caribbean Ocean, and they were able to use some of the Caribbean islands as transshipment points into the United States, principally southern Florida.
By 1985, 8 million Americans are hooked on the cocaine flooding into the country from Colombia. The DEA faces an uphill battle to identify the traffickers behind the surge in demand for this new must-have drug.
The 1980s were really the boom era, if you will, of cocaine here in the United States. And for some reason, it became a status symbol. It became a fad, and you were not part of the in crowd unless you had large quantities of cocaine or used large quantities of cocaine. And as a result of that, it became the economic law of supply and demand. And the Colombian criminals are probably some of the more astute in the world. And we started to see, emissaries of the cartels from Colombia coming into the United States and opening up distribution points, throughout the United States.
There was a market for cocaine, and there was nobody filling the market. And so Colombia jumped in because they were very well positioned geographically, and they had the infrastructure, and they had the know-how.
At 26, Escobar enters the cocaine business and rises quickly from smuggler to trafficker and then producer. Nothing and no one gets in his way.
He was arrested in the early 1980s with 18 kilograms of cocaine by the Colombian National Police. He was let go because he threatened the judge, and then he went after the police officers that arrested him and had them all killed.
Escobar became very powerful because he was willing to do whatever it took to advance the cocaine business.
By the mid-1980s, he is head of the powerful and infamous cocaine organization known as the Medellin cartel, and the payoff is colossal.
Pablo Escobar's organization was huge. He had the money to make it huge. Forbes magazine came out with their richest men in the world, and he was right near the top of the list. So right off the bat, you knew that this man was not a millionaire, he was a billionaire.
Escobar flaunts his immense fortune by building a vast luxury estate in the hills near Medellin.
The ranch had 9 man-made lakes, water slides, life-size dinosaurs made out of fiberglass. We estimate that he easily spent, maybe about $10 million in constructing that ranch. It made me angry because I knew that the mortar and concrete of that entire structure had come from blood money.
The cocaine godfather's tainted millions buy more than just fancy homes. He uses them to win the hearts and minds of the poor, paying for food banks, hospitals, and homes for slum dwellers makes Escobar a hero.
Pablo Escobar exploited poverty.
But he was doing that not for altruistic, but for very selfish reasons, to make sure that the people weren't selling him out, that they looked upon him as the Robin Hood, and he had places to go and hide then if necessary.
Escobar is so convinced that his Robin Hood image will make him untouchable, he takes the extraordinary step of entering politics.
He wanted to be elected to office, so it would bring some sort of legitimacy to Pablo Escobar.
Escobar's money has bought him so much popular support, he's a shoo-in as a local representative to the Colombian Congress, a position that guarantees immunity for past crimes. But then the Escobar roller coaster hits the buffers. In April 1984, the Justice Minister, Lara Bonilla, accuses him outright of bribery and corruption. He has signed his own death warrant.
Lara Bonilla leaves his office. He's being tracked by a motorcycle. He's in his car. The motorcycle weaves to the right-hand side of the vehicle. They open up with an Ingram and shoot Lara Bonilla several times in the head. The shooter was 16 years old, and the driver of that motorcycle was 19 years old. That would be equivalent to very young teenagers assassinating the Attorney General of the United States.
Lara Bonilla's murder sends shockwaves through Colombia. It seems Escobar has finally gone too far.
And then the game changed completely, because then Escobar had directly attacked the Colombian government. And that was something that no sitting president, no sitting Colombian government could tolerate.
he realized he lost his protection. That's when he turned to violence big time. It's almost like he lost his mind with it. Violence became his cause célèbre of the day, and if you were in his way, you were getting shot.
Escobar begins a reign of terror in his Medellin stronghold. This once booming commercial city becomes a killing field.
When I arrived in Medellin, I saw that it was a beautiful place. It was a progressive city, a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of construction. But once I was there for a month, I started to see bodies throughout Medellin, and I would leave my house early in the morning and I would see cadavers on the side of the road. And when I returned in the evening, a lot of those cadavers were still there because the police and the local authorities just couldn't keep up with the number of killings that were taking place in Medellin. And it was at that time known as the murder capital of Colombia.
But one thing still spooks the king of Medellin.
The only thing Escobar really feared was he feared extradition to the U.S. and he feared DEA as a result of that. He felt that he could work his way around the rest.
Escobar has been on the DEA's radar since the early 1980s, but its agents need an ironclad case to guarantee his extradition to the U.S. Now he uses his muscle and money to derail their investigation.
I finally had to leave the Medellin office because of threats to kidnap me.
The DEA aren't the only ones who want Escobar extradited. In August 1989, presidential candidate Luis Galan makes it clear if he is elected, Escobar will be on the first plane out of Colombia. But Escobar strikes first. Galan's murder launches open warfare between Escobar and the Colombian government.
I had never, ever seen organized crime try to take down a sovereign government the way he did. Unprecedented. Hasn't occurred since.
Escobar's attack on the authorities in Colombia goes hand in hand with a tidal wave of his cocaine reaching the United States. The more that comes in, the more the price goes down, until millions are hooked.
The addiction rates were skyrocketing. Cocaine became an epidemic of tremendous proportions.
The order goes out to the DEA to focus all their efforts on taking Escobar down. Special agent in charge, Joe Toft, finds himself leading the hunt.
I thought I was very well prepared for Colombia. It didn't take long for me to realize that I wasn't that prepared. From day one out there, the seizures, the bombings that Colombia was experiencing because of Escobar and his efforts to trying to intimidate the country, it was much greater than I thought it was.
If anyone can get Escobar, it's Joe Toft.
Joe Toft would be classified as a hard ass. He was a compassionate hard ass, but he demanded success. And in this case, he made sure that no stone was left unturned.
The DEA has no authority to arrest Escobar in Colombia. Instead, they work hand in hand with an elite new Colombian police unit. This is the Bloque de Búsqueda, or search block.
In my opinion, to be a member of the Colombian National Police and assigned to the Bloque de Búsqueda in the search for Pablo Escobar at the time was one of the most dangerous jobs in the world.
But any unit is only as good as its leader. And the Colombian police find just the man, a lean, no-nonsense police colonel called Hugo Martinez.
The leadership has to be from a person that's completely committed to the cause. He's going to know that Pablo Escobar is going to try and hurt him through his family. And Martinez proved to be that man.
Martinez has a personal score to settle. In 1989, Escobar's men murdered his best friend. His task is immense. Informers working for Escobar inside the Colombian National Police threaten to reveal every move he makes.
He's a very fine, noble man, a great leader, a man of undoubted integrity, and I think that very much helped to keep a lid on the confidentiality of what they were doing.
The DEA team believe the writing's on the wall for Escobar. But he has lost none of the ruthless instincts that brought him to the top of the Colombian cocaine trade.
When I arrived in Colombia, I was optimistic. I thought that, within a year or two, we would be able to get Escobar. But as time went by, it became clear that the corruption factor, the intimidation factor, made all of the normal police work that we would do up there pretty unlikely to succeed.
Despite Colonel Martinez's efforts, Escobar is tipped off by his sources in the police again and again.
The local units were completely penetrated by Escobar's people and by those who were to benefit by protecting Escobar.
Using informants, wiretaps, and surveillance, the DEA build a complete picture of Escobar's network. If they can't get him, they can get what he owns.
In order to take down a drug empire, there are numerous approaches that are taken. One of them is to attack the wealth, to seize the assets.
Starting with his lavish ranch, all Escobar's property is taken over by the government. Then it's his cash and his cocaine.
He seized vast amounts of money. And the other thing we're doing, we're trying to seize as much of his dope, as much of his cocaine as possible. And we had, record seizures.
60,000 kilos of cocaine and dozens of Escobar's top men are grabbed by the police. The drug lord's retaliation is swift and lethal.
Pablo Escobar put a $700 bounty for every police officer that was killed. And they just started killing police officers like it was going out of style. And that started a savage war. There was slaughter on the streets. And Medellin became a battleground between the drug traffickers and, civil authorities.
Escobar's thugs kill 30 search block officers in just 15 days. By 1991, a total of 457 police have been gunned down in Medellin.
The police officers that we trusted out there, that we worked with, were incredible. They put their lives, their families' lives on the line every day.
For Joe Toft, the loss of so many Colombian colleagues is almost unbearable.
I remember one particular funeral. I was right close to the casket and the stench, because they don't use embalming out there. And I saw this poor woman who was pregnant, probably 8 months pregnant, hanging onto the casket as they brought the casket and crying, with a little baby, probably 2 or 3-year-old baby, you know, that she's dragging with the other hand. I mean, I went home and cried. Just, you know, it was horrible.
Escobar isn't just targeting Colombian police officers. At the top of his hit list is the DEA chief himself.
There were 2 occasions where he put a price tag on my head. And DEA wanted to pull me out of the country. The ambassador said, "You're done here." And I fought it. Here I was working with the Colombians. I was asking them to do this. I was providing intelligence, and they're getting killed. And then there's a threat on my life, and I'm gonna leave Colombia.
Escobar has always been able to kill or threaten his way out of trouble. But the blood flowing in the streets of Medellin turns the tide against him.
His misbegotten thought, if you will, was that, hey, by doing that, he would buy some time for himself, or he would scare off the authorities. In fact, quite the opposite happened. It just angered people that much more, and they were going to get him one way or the other.
And in Joe Toft, Escobar has a relentless enemy.
I didn't want to leave Colombia without Escobar being either in jail or dead.
As the DEA and search blocs step up the pressure, Escobar blindsides them with a move no one expected. On June 19th, 1991, he hands himself over to the Colombian authorities on the condition they deny US extradition requests. The DEA can only watch as a helicopter flies him out of their reach to a private prison.
When Escobar turned himself in, we were extremely disappointed because we felt that we were really getting close to him. It was just a matter of time.
Sentenced to just 8 years on a minor drugs charge, the authorities think Escobar will be harmless behind bars.
As much as the DEA did not approve, you have to understand that the government of Colombia was facing a situation they had never seen before. No government has ever seen it before, where a man was setting off explosives, paying off politicians, killing politicians, killing journalists, killing innocent civilians. What were they going to do? They were searching for a solution.
From day one of his jail time, it's obvious that Escobar isn't going to suffer behind bars. The whole complex has been designed and built by his organization. Even the guards are on his payroll, and no police are allowed within 12 miles.
They had a discotheque, soccer field with lights, big TVs, best stereo sets you could come up with. There were double walls that contained weapons, money, drugs, you name it. I mean, it was not a prison, it was not a jail, it was country club living, basically.
Joe Toft is disgusted by the one-sided deal.
Everything was just, I mean, smelled awful. I mean, it was a complete capitulation by the government, again, because of fear.
With the search bloc and DEA off his back, Escobar has time to rebuild his drug empire. Thousands of kilos of cocaine are again on the move to the United States.
And we knew that was happening. We had intelligence on this, and we had been providing information to the government, to the president. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that, and I think that was part of the arrangement that they had with Escobar.
A year later, protests about Escobar's luxurious conditions forced the government to order his transfer to a high-security prison. But nothing goes right.
It was a combined army and police operation that was not well coordinated.
Tipped off by his informants, Escobar is not ready to go quietly. While his men try to hold off the troops sent for him, he breaks out and heads back to Medellin. Joe Toft and his team welcome the news.
He had escaped from prison, he had violated his agreement, and it placed us in a position to be able to be much more focused and interactive with the government, because they now saw that their strategy, their agreement with Pablo Escobar failed.
You know, I remember celebrating with the police officers that we trusted we worked with. It was a day, okay, we're back on, the game is back on. Now we're gonna go out and get them.
Once again, the elite Colombian search block unit and the DEA are back on the hunt.
We realized immediately that we would be going back to work exclusively to try and track down Pablo Escobar.
The Colombian government realizes there can be no more negotiation with Escobar. The $1 million reward for his capture is increased to $2.7 million by the Bush administration. But finding him won't be easy. Escobar enters an underground world of code names and aliases, of safe houses and ever-changing radio frequencies.
He did it successfully for quite a while, you know, running around in that taxi, you know, with different costumes or whatever.
But a new asset helps the DEA penetrate the fog of secrecy that has fallen over Escobar. Codenamed Centrospike and operated by a top-secret US Army intelligence unit, this is a flight of specially converted civilian light aircraft. Their state-of-the-art radio direction finding equipment homes in on Escobar's radio telephone calls.
The role of the US in terms of providing the high-tech capability to track the phone calls, it was clearly absolutely crucial.
Toft and his team feed information from Centrospike to Colonel Martinez and the search block to help them locate his hideout. Sensing his pursuers closing in, Escobar ratchets up the violence. On January 30th, 1993, he tries unsuccessfully to kill the head of the Colombian security service with a car bomb.
His car was going by, and his car was a bulletproof vehicle. It blew the car to one side. There were half bodies of children and people all over the street that were waiting for the school bus. And when you see that, and you still think the guy's a Robin Hood, it's hard for me to understand that.
21 people are killed, many of them children, and dozens more terribly injured. By now, Escobar isn't only being hunted by the DEA and the Colombian government. Rival drug traffickers want him taken down too.
You had the Cali cartel was furious with him because he had brought so much unwanted publicity to him, and they were actively hunting him.
Besides the Cali cartel, another murderous group is out to destroy him. They called themselves Los Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, those persecuted by Pablo Escobar, or Los Pepes for short. Escobar can thank his own brutality for bringing Los Pepes into existence.
Escobar had finally made enemies of his closest lieutenants by having them, having their legs sawn off with chainsaws in his presence. Well, obviously he made enemies of them as they died, but of their families and those around him.
The fact that many Los Pepes killers had been part of Escobar's organization gave them a huge advantage.
They knew about Escobar's infrastructure. They knew most of the people that worked for him. They knew pretty much everything about him. And so they systematically went out and started to hunt down Escobar's entourage and his remaining followers, and either took them out of commission or killed them outright.
Now, for every one of Escobar's attacks, there is a Los Pepes revenge killing.
Walls started to crumble for Pablo. His attorneys were killed. His associates were killed. Other members of Pablo Escobar's distant family were killed.
For the DEA, Los Pepes add a volatile new factor in an already complex and dangerous operation.
When we became aware that who the Los Pepes were, it was very important for DEA to recognize that and not in any way get tainted by the Los Pepes. I made sure every day, as we shared our intelligence with the cops, asked the police to make sure that this does not end up in the hands of Los Pepes, because I could just see that DEA provides intelligence that results in the killings of these people or something to that effect. So it would have been horrible.
But there is no denying that these lethal vigilantes are crippling Escobar's network in a way the DEA and Search Block couldn't.
Los Pepes were tremendously effective, and I think they were key in isolating Escobar fairly rapidly. They pretty much stripped him of much of his organization.
Well, it was to our advantage. You got to give Los Pepes a lot of credit for Pablo Escobar's demise, because they are the ones that waged the dirty war. The Los Pepes are really responsible for the fact that Pablo Escobar at the end was pretty much alone. I mean, he didn't have many people anymore.
Under attack from all sides, Escobar disappears into the maze of Medellin's back streets. To stay in control of his organization, he uses a radio phone, despite the risk of being tracked by police radio location teams on the ground and in the skies overhead.
Escobar was very streetwise. He knew what we were doing. He knew that we were using directional finding equipment, that we were monitoring his conversations. He never would speak from one place. Whenever he was talking on a phone, he would always be moving, because the triangulation is impossible to do if you're moving, and he knew that.
Again and again, the Search Block raid Escobar's suspected hideouts, but every time he's tipped off before they can get him.
I mean, the man was always prepared. He always had escape routes wherever he was at. He never stayed in a place more than a couple of days, because he knew sooner or later intelligence would leak out as to where he was.
Then on October 11th, 1993, Centra Spike intercepts a call from Escobar to his wife. Triangulating on the signal, they pinpoint the location to an isolated farmhouse. Immediately, Colonel Martinez orders his Search Block to mount an operation. Journalist Simon Strong gets caught up in the action.
He said, "Simon, we're going now. We have a bead on where Escobar is." It was just a sort of a slow afternoon, and suddenly one's drawn into the operation, going up a mountainside.
As the ground force close in on his hideout, US monitoring aircraft can still hear Escobar on the phone.
The assault team gets the command. Go.
The keyed-up troopers burst into the house, ready for an intense firefight. But there is no sign of their prey.
There were a lot of days that I thought this is going to be the day we get Pablo. And it ended in disappointment.
Escobar had gone to nearby woods to get a better signal for the call to his family. The brutal killer just won't cut contact with his wife, Maria Victoria, 16-year-old son, Juan Pablo, and 9-year-old daughter, Manuela. This gives Joe Toft, a crucial tactical advantage.
Focusing on his family, preventing the family from leaving Colombia, was a very key factor. And once we recognized that and we emphasized that, we could see the end coming around.
But the Los Pepes death squads, made up of Escobar's former gang members, have his family in their sights. On October 12th, Los Pepes detonate a massive bomb outside the family's apartment in Medellin. They escape with only minor injuries, but it's too close a call. Escobar is desperate to get them out of Colombia. His next move stuns the hardened DEA team.
One day, the ambassador calls me and he says, "Joe," he says, "you're not gonna believe who's downstairs." And I said, "Who?" And this is Pablo Escobar's son. So I went down and met with him.
The teenaged Juan Pablo walking into the embassy was surprise enough. But the deal his father proposes takes Toft's breath away.
I was very impressed with the young man, with his maturity. And, he basically said, myself, my mom, and my sister are afraid that we're going to get killed here by the Cali cartel. Would you please help us get out of the country? We would like to get a visa to the United States. And I basically told them, I said, if you came in here with a platter with the heads of the Cali cartel members, you still couldn't get a visa.
Escobar realizes there's no chance of his family escaping to the United States. Europe seems their best chance to stay out of Los Pepes' reach. A last-minute tip-off alerts Toft that the Escobars are on the move. Agent Ken McGee races to the airport.
We received intelligence that they were going to fly either to London, England, or to Frankfurt, Germany, and the planes were departing within 10 minutes of each other. We had tickets to jump on board either plane.
With no power to arrest or detain the Escobars in Colombia, the DEA has to work behind the scenes to convince other nations to turn the family away.
It was in our interest, as investigators, trying to find Pablo Escobar, that his family remain in Colombia. Therefore, by us providing this information to the host government of Germany, we would have the Escobars sent back to Colombia.
During the flight, McGee secretly photographs the Escobars. He has to make sure they have no contact with other passengers.
When I saw Pablo Escobar's young little daughter, I felt for that child. She was just an innocent young girl whose father was one of the most violent criminals on the face of the planet.
When they land, it's obvious the German authorities have been warned about their unwelcome guests.
When I arrived in Frankfurt, they stopped the aircraft in the middle of the runway. I remember taxiing down the runway, and I remember seeing tanks, police cars, all lined along the airstrip. And they escorted the Escobars off the aircraft and took them into a quarantined area, so to speak, in regards to determining what they were going to do with the Escobars.
Thanks to top-level contact between the German and Colombian governments, it doesn't take long for the Escobars to be given the news. Their plea for asylum is rejected. When he gets the news, Escobar goes into meltdown.
The minute he heard that Germany had denied the request, he was on the phone making threats, calling the German embassy, saying he would kill people, saying he would blow things up. There was no telling what would happen.
When they get back to Colombia, Escobar's family are taken to a hotel in the capital, Bogotá, under heavy police guard. As expected, Escobar immediately calls his wife. The plan to take him down is on a knife edge.
The walls were caving in around Pablo Escobar. He was taking more risks. He was making more phone calls. He was also becoming more threatening. in his tones. His acts of desperation made us feel that we were getting closer and closer and closer.
The noose is tightening around Colombian drug overlord Pablo Escobar. On December 2nd, 1993, a police radio location team intercepts a call he makes to his son.
He was so angry at his family not being allowed to leave the country that he started calling from one site, and that's how the police was able to triangulate and find him.
The commander of the search block, Colonel Hugo Martinez, has given the job of tracing Escobar's calls to the one man he knows he can trust absolutely, his own son.
So you have father and son in the world of criminal organization, and you have father and son in the world of law enforcement and what stands for right, good versus evil.
The phone trace leads the younger Martinez to a quiet residential street. Suddenly, he sees a figure at a second-story window. Every man in the Colombian police and DEA knows that face. It's Escobar.
We immediately contacted his superiors, to include his father, to say exactly where he was at and what he had found.
With just 2 men, Martinez calls urgently for backup. Search block patrols race desperately to Martinez's location. When they get there, they don't waste a second.
They arrived at this location and they immediately hit the place.
Even when cornered, Escobar shows how dangerous he can be.
He was armed with 2 semi-automatic pistols.
Escobar jumps from a back window to the roof of another house.
He had no idea that the place was surrounded. When he jumped out into the roof, he was shooting back at the window, thinking that he was being chased.
He was hit 3 times. He was wounded. He continued fire.
Escobar goes down in a hail of fire.
Pablo Escobar, that day, lived up to his reputation as being a notorious, cold-blooded killer that fought to the very end.
At 3:03 p.m., a search block officer is the first to reach Escobar's body.
When Pablo Escobar was killed on that rooftop, the very first message transferred over the radio was, "Viva Colombia, matamos a Pablo Escobar. Long live Colombia, we've just killed Pablo Escobar."
The men of the search block have at last settled the score.
They were elated, they were ecstatic, they were jubilant. You could use many words to describe how they felt, but one word most importantly is that they were proud.
150 miles away in Bogota, Joe Toft gets the news he has been waiting to hear for 6 long years.
I screamed, I said, "Pablo is dead, Pablo is finally dead." I was ecstatic.
The news of Escobar's death is flashed to Washington, and for the DEA, it's mission accomplished.
He had become a cancer to Colombia, and people were tired of his brand of terrorism because he was a narco-terrorist in every sense of the word.
Escobar was a monster. I wish he would have spent the rest of his life in prison. I mean, that's what I wanted. But he deserved what he got.
Even for Joe Toft, the successful end to the Escobar case has its downside.
I have 3 kids that I left behind. And to this day, I feel guilt for my first marriage, of having left them. And if I had to do it over again, I would not go because of my kids. Other than that, for me, I had the greatest job in the world. I was the head of the office going after Pablo Escobar. I think every DEA agent would have liked to have had that job.
The death of Pablo Escobar has given new life to Colombia.
There are many people that think of Colombia, and the first thing they think of is Pablo Escobar and drug trafficking. But that's not true. He was a major deal in Colombia, but Pablo Escobar is not Colombia, and Colombia is not Pablo Escobar. The people of Colombia are wonderful people.
Escobar's cocaine empire left a trail of death from Colombia to the USA and across the globe.
Pablo Escobar was the biggest criminal on the face of the planet, and the world will never see a criminal that big. There will be drug traffickers, there will be other criminals, but no one will grow to have that amount of power.
In the early days of a new century, a deadly drug is destroying communities and lives across America. Methamphetamine. On the street, it has many names: crystal, crank, glass, and ice. It's cheaper than cocaine to buy. And it delivers an instant and powerful high. By 2012, 1.2 million Americans in cities and rural communities are hooked on crystal meth. Many of them in their teens. The surge in crystal meth is fueling violent crime across the nation. Gangs engage in bitter turf wars for the right to distribute the drug. The US meth trade is controlled by one man, Joaquín Guzmán Loera. But the 5'6" drug lord is better known by his nickname, El Chapo, Mexican Spanish for Shorty.
At one point in time, probably 60 to 80% of the drugs that were coming into the United States from Mexico or originated from Chapo Guzmán.
Chapo Guzmán Loera is public enemy #1 in Los Angeles, in New York, in Miami, in El Paso, in Juarez, you name it.
The last time someone was branded public enemy #1 was Al Capone.
While his meth is making him millions in the US, his drug empire is leaving a trail of carnage across his home country of Mexico.
Chapo Guzmán is probably responsible directly and indirectly for at least 100,000 deaths in Mexico.
El Chapo is the latest in a long line of violent drug lords to come up through the Mexican underworld. Sources say Joaquín Guzmán Loera was born on December the 25th, 1954, in the small town of La Tuna, in the county of Sinaloa. A chip off the old block, he follows in his father's footsteps, straight into the drug business.
His father was a very brutal man, very violent, heavy drinker, and it was actually his father that introduced him to marijuana cultivation.
In 1981, 27-year-old El Chapo is introduced to the notorious godfather of Mexican drug lords, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. A former police officer turned drug kingpin, Miguel Félix holds a monopoly on drug trafficking throughout Mexico. He recruits Chapo first as his chauffeur, then as a cartel enforcer.
When you're an enforcer for the cartel, your job description is you'll do whatever it takes to maintain order, to collect money that needs to be collected, and if it means eliminating someone in the process, well, that's part of your vocation, unfortunately, as a sicario, an assassin, basically.
Chapo is soon put in charge of the all-important logistics of the cocaine trade.
He was pretty much a psychopath. He would kill individuals that lost loads to set an example for others to do a better job.
In 1987, Félix Gallardo gives him control of Sinaloa State and the Pacific Coast Corridor into the US. He orders the building of sophisticated tunnels under the border to smuggle cocaine in chili pepper cans.
He can move a load of cocaine from Mexico to the United States in one day. We're talking tons.
He is rumored to be smuggling $9 billion worth of cocaine into the US every year.
He was controlling the vast amount of drugs that were coming into the United States, from cocaine to marijuana to even heroin. So he was a great threat to the United States.
In 1989, Félix Gallardo is captured, sparking a brutal and bloody power struggle between El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel and the Tijuana cartel run by the Arellano Félix brothers.
And that's a fight over territory. And those different cartels wanted to control and take over more and more territory.
There were mountains of bodies, dismemberments, beheadings, just brutal killings.
They were hanging them on bridges with their feet cut off, or with their arms cut off, or their bodies found in a lineup with their heads cut off.
The killing spree turns the DEA's spotlight on the drug cartels. Leading the DEA investigation, first in New Orleans and 9 years later in Mexico City, is Joe Bond, a special agent at the DEA since 1988.
I love my job, and being after the most powerful drug cartel leader at the time, it excited me.
But the DEA aren't the only ones after the Sinaloan kingpin. So are his business rivals, the Arellano Félix brothers, leaders of the Tijuana cartel. In May 1993, Ramon and Javier Arellano Félix descend on Guadalajara to hunt down El Chapo.
The Arellano brothers had hired some gang bangers to come to Guadalajara specifically to search out and assassinate Chapo Guzmán Loera.
The assassins scour the city in search of their prey.
They went hunting for Chapo Guzmán, couldn't find him.
But after several days, the Tijuana cartel get a break.
They were at the airport getting ready to go back to Tijuana.
Ramon had received information that Chapo Guzmán was coming to the airport in Guadalajara, in Jalisco, and was going to take a plane, and this is a particular car that he was going to be driving.
The informant is convinced he's spotted the kingpin, sitting in his trademark Buick sedan in the airport parking lot, also waiting for a flight. Wasting no time, Ramon Arellano Félix dispatches his assassins.
When they get to the Guadalajara airport, they see the car, they approach the car, and they open fire on the car.
The assassins riddle the car with bullet holes. There's only one problem. The man sitting in the Buick sedan is not Chapo Guzmán.
It was Posada Ocampo, the Cardinal, who was driving a car similar to Chapo's.
The hitmen have murdered the highest-ranking member of the Catholic Church in Mexico.
A case of mistaken identity. They mistook the Cardinal for Chapo Guzmán Loera.
Después de años de investigaciones, las autoridades conclusiones sobre los sucesos que desembocaron en la muerte del Cardenal.
Their real target is just a short distance away. Having narrowly escaped death, he does what he does best and makes a quick exit. Today, more than 20 years later, the motive for the Cardinal's assassination is still a matter of speculation.
The assassination of Cardinal Posadas is a very peculiar story that I believe has not been resolved.
The official view is that this was a case of mistaken identity. But some DEA agents believe in a more sinister theory.
There's too many unanswered questions. There's too many incredible assumptions as to who, how, and why.
A new theory suggests that Chapo was just a scapegoat and Cardinal Posadas was always the intended victim.
The Cardinal himself was the actual target. There was very sensitive information that he was going to deliver that had to do with the drug trade.
Many speculate that the Cardinal was holding documents that reveal a conspiracy between the cartels and the Mexican government.
If you were to write a whodunit murder mystery, this would be a perfect subject matter because it involves intrigue at the highest levels.
To this day, no one knows if there really was a conspiracy between the drug lords and senior Mexican politicians. Either way, the Mexican government couldn't sit idly by. The assassination of Cardinal Posadas causes outrage.
In Mexico, being such a religious country, I mean, this is an uproar. So the government had to do something about this.
Suspicion inevitably falls on the cartels. Stung into action, the Mexican government offers a $5 million bounty for each of the cartel leaders. But the cartel kings go quiet. El Chapo has disappeared. But barely 2 weeks later, astonishing news reaches the DEA. A Mexican informant has spotted El Chapo in a hotel. Not in Mexico, but in neighboring Guatemala, where he bribes local police officials to protect him and his flow of drugs through their country. But unfortunately for him, he doesn't pay them enough.
The money he was paying them at the time to protect them did not cover the cost of protecting such a high-level individual involved in such, at the time, a very scandalous and very public type of incident.
Harboring this wanted gangster isn't worth the trouble. The police tip off the Guatemalan army. At a hotel near Tapachula, the Guatemalan army move in and arrest him. In days, he's extradited back to Mexico.
They knew that he would create a lot of issues if they allowed him to remain in Guatemala.
After he arrives back in Mexico, El Chapo is sentenced to 20 years and 9 months on charges of drug trafficking, criminal association, and bribery. And that should be the end of the story for this drug lord. Instead, it's just the beginning. The moment El Chapo steps foot inside prison, first in Almoya, and 2 years after, in Puente Grande prison, he lays down his law.
Within days, the prison guards were calling him boss, el patrón. And they gave him anything that he wanted. If you were his friend, he would take care of you. If you were his enemy, you were going to end up in a coffin rather quickly.
He showed his power in jail, and he was untouchable. The fear that he put in these people, it was obvious.
Associates bring him suitcases stuffed with cash to bribe prison staff.
It wasn't the warden that controlled the penitentiary, it was Chapo Guzmán. And it was not only because of the money, but they also feared him, because they knew that if they opposed him, he had the ability to have them killed within the penitentiary or outside the penitentiary.
There's a saying in Mexico, plata o plomo. It's either silver or lead, which meant either you take our payoff or we'll kill you.
Puente Grande is more than El Chapo's business headquarters. It's his personal playground.
It really was a party, and he also would invite the guards and the inmate population. There would be liquor, he would bring in some high-priced prostitutes.
Although already married and divorced twice, the 40-year-old kingpin becomes infatuated with a female inmate, Zulema Hernandez, who was in prison on robbery charges. At first, she resists his charms, but eventually becomes his prison girlfriend.
He was considered to be like the Rudolph Valentino of the Guadalajara cartel because he loved women. You know, that was his big thing. He loved good-looking women.
From inside prison, El Chapo maintains complete control over his drug empire. Despite knowing this, Mexico still refuses repeated requests to extradite him to a maximum security prison in the US. Then in January 1998, Joe Bond gets a stunning call out of the blue. It's from El Chapo's brother-in-law. He says the drug lord wants the DEA to come and talk to him in prison. If El Chapo wants to become an informant and give up key names in the cartel's operations, it would present a huge opportunity for the war on drugs.
So our whole goal, we had to get to the key people in order to dismantle that organization. If we could get that information from this guy, who would be better than him to provide that intel?
In October 1998, DEA agents Larry Villalobos and Joe Bond enter Puente Grande prison posing as Mexican human rights inspectors. With every step they take, they know they're putting their lives on the line.
Our biggest concern was, what if Chapo just wanted some kind of revenge? Will they torture us to find out what we know, who we know? Will they lock down the jail once they know that we've been kidnapped? And ultimately, will they kill us?
El Chapo doesn't know exactly when or how the agents will arrive, but he's been told that they will introduce themselves as Tito.
We arrived to the jail and they took us to this infirmary and they told us to wait there until they brought Chapo.
Once alone, the agents scan the room for bugs.
We looked under the table, we looked at the table, we looked at the chairs. We felt comfortable enough that we could talk to Chapo there, that we were not being monitored.
After years of hunting him, the agents are finally face to face with the legendary kingpin.
And I introduced, I said, Mr. Guzmán Loera, I am Tito. And honestly, he turned white. He could not believe that we were there. He looked at me, he looked at Larry, he says, don't say anything else. He got on his hands and feet and knees, and he looked under the door to make sure that nobody was standing there, listening to what he was about to tell us.
But the agents still don't know if this is a trap that could cost them their lives. Suddenly, he offers to give up the names of officials he's bribed.
He was mad, he was upset, he had been there 5 years. He just was ready to talk about everything, corruption. And I said, well, we have to time out. I said, okay, well then, we know you're still controlling things, and we know you're controlling here, things in Puente Grande as well. And he just smiled.
Bond indulges Chapo's gloating, hoping to draw out nuggets of intelligence.
We went there knowing everything about El Chapo, and he realized that. So every time we asked him out of a certain investigation, he would praise himself and he says, yep, I handled that, and I did it well, didn't I? Just like that. And he says, yep, you were amazing. We would tell him, because he was. He was charismatic and very smart. He was a thinker, and we got that impression from him immediately.
Finally, he comes clean with what he most wants, to cut a deal with the DEA. He offers to hand over drug trafficking routes. In return, he wants the US to drop its request to extradite him and try him in the States.
He says, you let me handle Mexico and my time in Mexico. I can handle that here. My biggest fear is having to go to the United States and get extradited.
Chapo's millions buy him every luxury in a Mexican prison, but he knows maximum security in a US jail would be a very different experience. The agents make no promises, but agree to talk to their superiors. But the DEA has no intention of playing ball. He's wanted in too many places.
He wasn't just going to respond to one charge in Arizona. He needed to respond charges in New Mexico, California, New York, Chicago, Atlanta. All these places had charges against him.
El Chapo never hears from the DEA again. So with the threat of extradition still hanging over his head, El Chapo starts to plan his riskiest move yet. On the evening of January the 19th, 2001, a guard makes his usual rounds through the corridors of Puente Grande. As he approaches El Chapo's cell, he notices the door is open, and the prisoner is gone. Inside the prison, chaos. Inmates and guards are rounded up and interrogated as the police frantically search every cell, room, and closet. In towns near the prison, the Mexican army raid houses, ranches, and government buildings looking for the kingpin. But El Chapo has vanished. Just a few hours earlier, at around 9:45 p.m., Francisco Rivera, a prison administrator, opened the cell and the kingpin jumped into a laundry cart. Passing through several security doors before escaping in a waiting truck. After 8 years behind bars, El Chapo is now a free man. Over the following days, prison guards are detained again to find out how he got out. All accounts are rife with holes and contradictions. But one brave guard reveals that El Chapo had carefully masterminded his escape plan, wielding influence over almost everyone in the prison.
Sources have said from prison that Chapo Guzmán had paid almost $2 million to effectuate that escape.
The prison guard claims that by the time El Chapo escaped, he controlled Puente Grande so thoroughly that there was no need for subterfuge.
One source tells us that he did not escape in laundry cart, but rather he walked out the front door. When the time came and everybody was paid off, the door was open, and he walked out.
The prison guard who talked is found dead several weeks later. Making up for lost time, the drug lord immediately tackles unfinished business. He takes the cartel wars to a whole new level, exacting revenge on an unprecedented scale.
Now that he was actually out of jail, crime increased against the Arellano and the Chapo Guzmán organization, the Sinaloa cartel. Killings, they were killing each other.
It was, okay, well, you're gonna kill 10 of my people, I'm gonna go and behead 50 of yours, and then I'm gonna pile them up on the outskirts of a town.
Out of prison, El Chapo is now fair game to his cartel rivals. But they aren't the only ones gunning for him. The DEA also take up the chase with renewed determination. Thanks to local informants, agents believe the drug lord is hiding out somewhere on his home turf, the mountains of Sinaloa.
It's a very austere, hostile environment, but he knew it like the back of his hand.
For 3 years, there are almost no sightings of the drug lord, now aged 47. Meanwhile, hundreds of tons of cocaine keep flooding into the US. Then, out of the blue, a reliable informant delivers the first strong lead. El Chapo is holed up at a ranch in La Tuna, Badiraguato, 60 miles from Culiacan. This time, the Mexican authorities take on the chase. 200 Mexican soldiers are sent to the Sinaloa ranch. But El Chapo's henchmen spot the helicopters coming miles away.
He had a lot of resources, lookout scouts.
As usual, El Chapo has a cunning escape plan in place for just such an emergency.
When they approached, there were about 50 individuals that jumped on these four-wheeler vehicles. And they scattered like cockroaches throughout the countryside. Well, the military didn't know which four-wheeler Chapo Guzmán was in, so they all escaped.
For another 3 years, El Chapo lays very low. But his obsession with beautiful women will soon lure him out of the shadows again. In November 2007, El Chapo gets married for a fourth time to Emma Coronel. She's an 18-year-old beauty queen, the daughter of one of his deputies. The Mexican army get wind of the happy news and crash the party, but they're too late. Their prey has slipped away yet again.
It's like having a serial killer in your clutches, and then he escapes only to kill more people.
Safe in the valleys of the Sierra Madre, El Chapo finds he can distribute a new drug that will make him even more money than cocaine. It's called methamphetamine. Produced by mixing amphetamine with chemicals from common over-the-counter drugs. It's cheaper to produce than cocaine and more addictive. That makes it the ideal illegal substance. And El Chapo goes all in.
He started to go into the methamphetamine business, and he was buying kilos of the precursor, which is ephedrine, for $65 a kilo. And then once he converted it into methamphetamine, now all of a sudden he takes an initial investment of $65 a kilo and he sells it for $18,000 or higher on US streets.
Cocaine is made from coca plants that don't grow in Mexico. For the first time, crystal meth gives Mexican drug lords a viable product they can produce and distribute themselves.
They already had the existing infrastructure and they had the existing pipelines to take that methamphetamine and then funnel it right into the US consumer market.
In 4 years, El Chapo becomes the biggest meth producer in the world. His Sinaloa cartel is rumored to supply 80% of the US meth trade. His fortune is worth billions. And his glamorous young wife, Emma Coronel, doesn't understand why they can't enjoy that fortune.
He was a billionaire, and then he had a young beauty queen as a wife, and here he is living like a pauper up in this rugged mountainous area. He had no creature comforts, so he wanted to enjoy the fruits of his labors.
Despite the risks, El Chapo moves to Culiacan and visits the swanky beach resorts on the Sinaloa coast. For the first time in years, the drug baron is within earshot of sophisticated surveillance.
He was now in an urban area, which made it easy to track him and find him. Now he had entered into the den of the tiger.
In December 2011, the DEA combined forces with Homeland Security to hunt down the drug lord. In 2012, a routine wiretap unexpectedly leads to a phone linked to one of Chapo's henchmen.
As with most wiretap investigations, they lead to additional numbers. And eventually, they started to identify calls and phone numbers that belonged to Chapo Guzmán and his organization.
Agents soon track down El Chapo's personal mobile number. As they monitor his communications, they come to know their target intimately.
He likes popsicles, he likes peanuts. He's very much connected to electronics in terms of every safe house that he has. He has a television screen where he's monitoring. He's very careful in terms of what he eats, that it got to the point where he had people tasting his food before he would.
But his major weakness is still his love of women.
To juggle all these relationships with girlfriends, the wives and the ex-wives, having to focus at the same time also on the business, maybe left him a little open and careless at times.
He's spending more time on the coast with his trophy wife, ex-girlfriends, and prostitutes, making him more exposed than ever. But El Chapo still feels safe inside his ring of steel, hideouts and safe houses, rigged with the latest high-tech security systems.
He could go through the draining system from one house to the other. He would not have to go out in the street. And then he had underlings that would go out, buy food or whatever he needed.
As an added security protection, El Chapo changes the way he communicates.
Remember, he's on the run. He can't just throw down his phone. He still needs water, food, beverages. He needs to be able to communicate with somebody, right? So he might change devices, but somehow, some way, he's got to communicate with somebody.
To make tracking calls harder, messages to the boss are now relayed through two subordinates who spend the day traveling between wireless hotspots across the city. But the kingpin's clever plan gives agents a new strategy, targeting his inner circle to get to the man himself.
So rather than look at the Sinaloa cartel's organizational structure and try to get to him that way, we looked at his inner circle.
After 2 years, Homeland Security has mapped out those closest to the crime boss.
We built out an entire organizational network of El Chapo and his inner circle, from his people cooking for him, to cleaning the house, from his bodyguards to his communication and command structure.
The agencies then approach Mexican authorities for support.
You just can't recruit a couple of local police officers from a small town in Mexico to go in and do it. It has to be a group of untouchables, but on law enforcement side, that would go in and conduct and effect the arrest. And this group are the Marines.
In mid-January, a Special Forces unit of commandos from SEMA, the Mexican Marines, assemble at a forward operating base near the resort town of Los Cabos. The Marines, the Mexican equivalent of Navy SEALs, are joined by a select group of DEA agents. Their objective? To capture El Chapo's top lieutenants. But with Chapo's extensive network of informants, agents keep details of each operation close to their chests.
They did not know until the last minute on who they were actually going to capture and arrest. And the Mexican military and SAMAR unit kept it as a need-to-know basis because they wanted to maximize success of this operation.
After weeks of surveillance, the Marines move in to round up El Chapo's henchmen and their mobile phones.
Whenever raids occur, among the things authorities often find besides the weapons and the ammunition and the bulletproof vests are the telephones.
With each phone seized, a new set of numbers is gathered, allowing agents to map out El Chapo's entire inner circle. Several of El Chapo's bodyguards are arrested.
They were taken into custody by the Mexican Marines, who then engaged in scientific interrogation, if you know what I mean.
Under intense pressure, El Chapo's bodyguards blow the lid off their boss's location. A two-story house on Rio Humaya Street, a middle-class neighborhood in Culiacan. Just before dawn, the Marines arrive at the safe house. They surround the building. They've now got El Chapo cornered. The Marines ready their weapons and produce a battering ram.
They came across a very heavily fortified residence. Steel-plated doors that were engineered to prevent the Mexican military law enforcement for ever getting in there.
Ten minutes later, they finally break in and reach the bathroom. The bathtub has been raised with hydraulic lifts.
And Chapo Guzmán, within the first 20 seconds, had already lifted the bathtub, climbed down the stairs, and fled. They discovered the tunnel, and they went into the drainage system, and they could hear the splash coming from Chapo Guzmán.
The soldiers race down into a labyrinth of interlocking tunnels beneath the city streets.
Obviously, it's very narrow, so that, just a spray of bullets would have killed quite a few of the Marines.
El Chapo and his only remaining bodyguard have a 10-minute head start on the Marines. Meanwhile, above ground, dozens of troops position themselves, ready to jump on the drug lord as soon as he surfaces. A covert US drone is deployed to monitor the city's streets. Meanwhile, Chapo calls one of his henchmen to pick him and his bodyguard up.
Enforcers or organizers in Culiacán, they picked him up, took him down the highway, and then they switched vehicles, and he's gone.
When the commandos emerge at a storm drain by the banks of a muddy river, there's no sign of their target anywhere. It's a crushing disappointment, but it turns out to be short-lived. 2 days later, El Chapo's bodyguard is sending a text that will lead them straight to the kingpin's new lair. The next morning at dawn, 40 Marines assemble at a beachfront apartment complex.
They were able to pinpoint his location at the Airmar condominiums, which was right on the water there in Mazatlan.
The Marines circle the building.
So they checked with workers there at the condominium complex, and they found out that only 2 parties had checked in the previous day.
Chapo could be in one of them. Marines climb to the 6th floor and ready their weapons.
Here now you are a doorway away from the most wanted man in the world. You're not expecting him to go down without a fight.
They went to the first apartment and they basically kicked down the door. And there was an American couple in there, and they were absolutely in shock.
Commandos secure the apartment and radio their colleagues. No sight of their target yet.
They knew that they had to now move very quickly, so they went down to the 4th floor. They immediately subdued one of his bodyguards that was in there.
Infrared and thermal imaging pinpoint the locations of everyone inside the condo. They burst through the door. El Chapo's young wife, Emma Coronel, is terrified.
Please, don't come out!
A Marine makes his way to the bathroom door.
there's somebody behind it. The Marines shout for the person to reveal himself.
He had an AK-47, but he knew it was suicide by police if he tried to go for it.
The wife is still screaming, don't kill him, don't kill him, don't do anything to him. He's the father of my children.
The Mexican Marines take no prisoners. Had they been provoked and Chapo Guzmán just made any slight movement towards that weapon, he would have not been able to fit in a casket with all the lead that would have been pumped into his body.
In less than 3 minutes, the Mexican Marines have taken down the world's biggest drug kingpin.
So he was taken into custody, didn't make any comments, was very sullen, very quiet.
You know the old saying, caught with your pants down? He was basically caught with his pants down.
A fingerprint and a DNA swab confirm the captured man is indeed Joaquín Guzmán Loera.
We knew at that time that the Sinaloa cartel and their leadership had just suffered the biggest blow that they'd ever had in the history of that cartel.
El Chapo is sentenced to 20 years and 9 months in prison on charges of drug trafficking, criminal association, and bribery. The criminal mastermind is locked up at Altiplano, Mexico's super maximum security prison. Mexican authorities vow he will never escape again. A security camera monitors El Chapo in his cell 24/7. At 8:52 p.m., he walks over to the bathroom area and disappears. Once again, he's made his escape in a tunnel, this time a mile-long passage dug beneath his shower, equipped with a custom-built motorcycle on rails. At its end, a half-finished house on a deserted road built specifically for his escape. An international manhunt is currently underway to capture him.